The landlord lifted his trash can, leaned over the balcony, and dumped the whole thing right on his tenant's doorstep, laughing, not knowing he just poured garbage on the wrong man. If you don't support racism or bullying of any kind, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will make your blood boil. Every single morning, he did it. The same twisted ritual. The same wicked grin spreading across his face like he'd just won some cruel lottery. And every single morning, the young tenant would quietly clean it up, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the rotting food and soiled paper, swallow his anger like bitter medicine, and walk to work like nothing had happened, like his dignity hadn't just been trampled on before the sun even fully rose. His name was Derek, and if you saw him on the street, you'd see a hard-working young black man in his mid-20s, always walking with purpose, always dressed neatly despite his circumstances. He lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment downstairs, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's television, where the paint peeled in the corners, and where the rent was still somehow too high for what you got. He was struggling to make ends meet, like so many young people trying to build a life in the city. Life in the city wasn't easy, not by a long shot. Rent was high, climbing higher every year like it was racing toward the clouds. Food prices were worse, making him calculate every purchase, every meal, stretching dollars until they screamed. And his landlord, Mr. Clifford, made it even harder, made every day feel like walking through a minefield where any wrong step could explode his fragile stability. Clifford was in his late 50s, loud in that way that demands attention, arrogant in that way that assumes superiority is a birthright, and proud of things that had nothing to do with character. He believed owning the building gave him the right to treat everyone else like dirt, like his name on a deed meant he owned not just property but people's dignity too. He would throw his weight around the compound, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence before you even saw him, bark orders at tenants like they were servants rather than paying residents, and insult people over the smallest things, a misplaced trash bag, a visitor parked in the wrong spot, a child playing too loudly. But what made him truly cruel, what separated him from just being an unpleasant landlord to being something darker, was how he singled out Derek. It started small, or at least it seemed small at first. A comment here, a look there, the kind of microaggressions that people tell you to ignore, that people say you're being too sensitive about. But then it escalated. Then it became deliberate. Then it became the trash. Every morning at dawn, when the world was still painted in shades of gray and purple, when the street lights were just beginning to surrender to the coming sun, Derek would wake up to a pile of trash right outside his door. Not just a little trash, not an accidental spill. A deliberate pile. Leftovers from someone else's dinner, congealed and cold. Plastic bags torn open and leaking. Spoiled food that had been sitting in someone's kitchen for days, breeding bacteria and stench. Sometimes even cigarette ash, still gray and powdery, scattered across the top like some sick garnish. Used tissue, crumpled and disgusting. Coffee grounds, eggshells, moldy bread, everything that should have been in a proper trash receptacle was instead deposited right at Derek's threshold like an offering to disrespect. And it always came from Clifford's balcony upstairs, always from that second-floor perch where the landlord could look down on everyone in every sense of the word. Each time Derek looked up after discovering the mess, he'd see him standing there, coffee cup in hand, steam rising from it in the cool morning air, smiling like a man who enjoyed seeing others suffer, who fed off humiliation the way normal people feed off breakfast. "Good morning, boy." Clifford would shout, his voice dripping with mockery, emphasizing that word, that diminishing word that carried centuries of disrespect in its 2 syllables. Derek would only nod, holding his tongue between his teeth, literally biting down sometimes to keep the words from spilling out. He couldn't afford a fight, couldn't afford the luxury of pride expressing itself as confrontation. His rent was due in 2 months, and he was already behind on building up the funds, already calculating whether he'd have to skip meals or cancel his phone service to make it work. The last thing he wanted was eviction, was being thrown out onto the street with nowhere to go, with his few possessions in trash bags, ironically enough, becoming homeless because he refused to be disrespected. So he cleaned up the mess, every single day, his back bent, his hands touching things that turned his stomach, took a shower to wash off not just the physical grime but the feeling of being degraded, and went to work. He worked part-time at the Environmental Sanitation Authority, as a field assistant. It wasn't glamorous, nothing about it made people's eyes light up when he told them what he did. Mostly reports, filing and cross-referencing and making sure information was where it needed to be. Community checks, walking through neighborhoods and documenting conditions, talking to residents about their concerns. And public cleanups, organizing volunteers, picking up trash ironically, making communities better one bag of refuse at a time. But it was honest work, work that mattered even if it didn't pay what it should. Derek believed in order, in the idea that systems should function fairly. He believed in dignity, in the fundamental respect that every human being deserved regardless of their station. And he believed in keeping his peace, in not letting the world's cruelty turn him into something cruel himself. But everyone has a breaking point, that invisible line where patience becomes participation in your own degradation, where turning the other cheek just means giving someone a fresh target. One morning, when he opened his door, the smell hit him before his eyes could process what he was seeing. It was the kind of smell that makes your body recoil instinctively, that triggers every warning system evolution gave us about contamination and disease. Spoiled meat, gray and green and glistening with decomposition. Maggots crawling, their pale bodies writhing through the refuse like living rice. Rotten food dripping down the steps, creating a trail of filth that would stain the concrete. Clifford had done it again, only worse this time, like he was escalating, like he was testing just how much Derek would tolerate before breaking. Derek stared at it for a long time, standing in his doorway in his undershirt and sweatpants, frozen. His jaw tightened, the muscles working under his skin. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, then released, then clenched again. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, could feel heat rising up his neck. For a moment, just a moment, he imagined storming upstairs, imagined confronting Clifford with all the rage he'd been swallowing for months, imagined what it would feel like to finally say everything he'd been holding back. Then slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone from his pocket, and he hit record. He filmed everything, moving the camera carefully to capture every detail. The trash on his doorstep, making sure the amount and nature of it was visible. The dripping liquid creating those telltale stains. The maggots, impossible to fake, impossible to claim were from his own negligence. He filmed Clifford's laughter from above, that braying sound that carried so much contempt. His mocking voice saying, "Next time, pay rent early or I'll make it double." The threat casual, thrown out like a joke but carrying real weight. Derek didn't respond. He didn't give Clifford the satisfaction of a reaction, didn't let him see the effect his cruelty was having. He simply saved the video, backed it up to his cloud storage just to be safe, cleaned up the mess one last time with his jaw still tight and his movements precise and controlled, and left for work. That week, something changed at his office. Not just for Derek, but for the whole department. His boss, Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 50s who believed in the mission of environmental protection with the fervor of a true believer, announced a new initiative. A crackdown on illegal waste disposal and environmental violations. The city was tired of people treating public spaces like their personal dumps, tired of property owners who thought regulations didn't apply to them. The job would involve surprise inspections, teams showing up unannounced to check complaints. Field fines, actual penalties with teeth. And public sanitation enforcement, making examples of violators to discourage others. Derek listened carefully, sitting in the break room with his coffee growing cold in his hands. His mind raced, connections forming, possibilities opening up like doors he hadn't known were there. He thought about the video on his phone. He thought about Clifford's face. He thought about justice, real justice, not the revenge fantasy kind but the systematic, legal, documented kind. That night, sitting at his small kitchen table with only his desk lamp for light, he sent an anonymous report to the authorities' complaint desk. He attached the video, watching it one more time before hitting send, seeing his own doorstep covered in filth, hearing Clifford's mocking voice. He included the address, the exact location down to the apartment number. And the time of day, dawn, when the dumping always occurred. He didn't mention his name anywhere in the report. He didn't want credit. He just wanted justice, clean and simple and deserved. The following Friday morning arrived with the weight of fate in it, though Clifford couldn't feel it yet. He woke up early as usual, his routine unchanged, his arrogance unshaken. He lifted his trash can, the same battered plastic container he'd been using for this ritual, leaned over the balcony railing that was rusted at the joints, and emptied it right onto Derek's doorstep again, laughing that same laugh that had become the soundtrack to Derek's humiliation. "Good morning, boy," he shouted, his voice carrying through the compound, making sure everyone heard, making sure everyone knew who had the power here. "You like my early delivery?" But this time, Derek didn't move the way he usually did. He didn't immediately start cleaning. He didn't hurry to erase the evidence of his mistreatment before going to work. He just looked up, his face calm, his eyes steady, and said quietly, almost gently, "Good morning, sir." The politeness wasn't weakness. It was control. It was power that didn't need to announce itself. Then he stepped inside, washed his face with cold water that shocked his system awake, put on his green uniform, the official Environmental Sanitation Authority uniform that he'd pressed the night before, making sure every crease was sharp, and he waited. Just waited. Sitting on his couch. Watching the clock. Breathing steady. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the sound of engines echoed through the street, a mechanical rumble that was unusual for this early hour in this quiet neighborhood. 3 white vans pulled up in front of the compound, official vehicles with the city seal on the sides. The Environmental Sanitation Enforcement Unit. Officers stepped out, men and women in matching uniforms, carrying clipboards, cameras with official documentation stamps, and folders full of official documents, regulations printed in small type that carried the force of law. Clifford froze at the balcony, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Confusion crossed his face, then something that might have been the first whisper of concern. "Who are these people?" he shouted down, his voice not quite as confident as usual. One officer, a tall woman with gray hair pulled back tight, called out in a voice trained to carry authority, "We received a report of illegal waste disposal from this address. We need to conduct an inspection." Clifford laughed, but it was nervous now, with a tremor in it that hadn't been there before. "Inspection? What nonsense. I'm the landlord here. I own this building." But then the gate opened with a metallic squeal, and out walked Derek. In full uniform. Badge pinned to his chest, catching the early morning light. He joined the officers, his movements calm and professional, his face showing none of the emotion churning inside him. The entire compound went silent. Other tenants who had been watching from windows, who had heard the commotion, pressed closer to see. The morning seemed to hold its breath. "Good morning, Mr. Clifford," Derek said, his voice carrying across the space between them with perfect clarity. "We're here to address a sanitation violation, one you're personally responsible for." Clifford's mouth fell open. Actually fell open, like his jaw had forgotten how to work. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, anger, fear, and finally something close to panic. You work with them?" he stammered, his coffee cup shaking in his hand, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Yes, sir," Derek replied firmly, not with triumph but with professional dignity. "And I have the evidence. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated, ever been dismissed, ever been treated like you were less than someone else, then you understand what Derek felt in that moment. Hit that like button because justice is about to be served." The officers began their work with the thoroughness of people who knew their documentation would stand up in court. They started recording on official cameras, every angle, every detail. They photographed the trash on the ground, making sure to get wide shots that showed the full extent and close-ups that captured the nature of the waste. The stains from weeks of dumping, dark marks on the concrete that told a story of repeated offense. And even the trail leading back to Clifford's balcony, an undeniable connection between the perpetrator and the crime scene. One officer, a younger man with a mustache and a serious expression, read out the charges from his clipboard, his voice flat and official: multiple counts of illegal waste disposal, endangerment of public health, violation of Environmental Code sections 12, 15, and 23. Each charge carried fines. Each charge carried consequences. Added together, they painted a picture of someone who had been breaking the law repeatedly, flagrantly, and with malicious intent. Clifford tried to protest, his voice rising in pitch, words tumbling over each other. "This is ridiculous. I can do what I want with my trash. This is my property. You can't come in here and..." But they ignored him. Professionally, completely, they ignored him. The law didn't care about his protests. The regulations didn't bend because he thought he was special. They continued their inspection, documenting everything, their pens moving across forms, creating an official record that would follow him. The fine amount was heavy. Thousands of dollars, enough to make even a property owner wince. But the embarrassment was worse, cutting deeper than any financial penalty could. Neighbors gathered, people who had watched Clifford bully others for years, some even filming the moment on their phones, documenting his downfall the way he'd never thought to worry about. The same man who used to bully everyone, who had made himself large through making others feel small, was now being forced to sweep his own mess under official supervision, officers standing over him to make sure he did it properly. Clifford bent down, his knees cracking audibly in the morning silence, broom in hand that one of the officers had made him retrieve from his own apartment. His hands were trembling, whether from age or shame or rage, it was hard to tell. Probably all three. He swept slowly, every stroke an admission of guilt, every pile of trash he collected a piece of his dignity being scraped away. Sweat formed on his forehead even though the morning was cool. His breathing became labored. This man who had lorded over others was being brought low, literally, bent over and cleaning like he'd made Derek do every single morning. Derek watched silently, standing with the officers but slightly apart, not with revenge burning in his eyes but with quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from seeing justice work the way it's supposed to. When Clifford looked up at him, their eyes meeting across the compound, Clifford's eyes were watery, maybe from exertion, maybe from something else. In that moment, Derek said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet, "Sir, next time you throw trash on someone, remember that some of us know where to take it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even really an insult. It was a statement of fact, a reminder that actions have consequences, that the world sometimes has a way of balancing the scales. That moment, captured on multiple phones, went viral across the neighborhood by lunchtime. The video spread through social media, through community groups, through the network of people who had all suffered under Clifford's arrogance in one way or another and who found satisfaction in finally seeing him held accountable. The community association, empowered by the viral attention and the official action, held an emergency meeting that very weekend. They voted, and it wasn't even close. Clifford was removed as caretaker, stripped of the informal authority he'd assumed came with being a landlord. He was fined heavily by the city, penalties that would take months to pay off. And he was ordered to apologize publicly to his tenants, to stand in front of the people he'd mistreated and acknowledge his wrongdoing. The apology, when it came, was painful to watch. Clifford stood in a common area, his shoulders slumped, his voice barely above a mumble, and he read from a prepared statement. He didn't mean it, anyone could see that, but he had to say the words anyway. Had to admit what he'd done. Had to face the people he'd tried to diminish. Weeks passed. The compound slowly returned to a new normal, one where people walked with their heads a little higher, where tenants didn't flinch when they heard heavy footsteps. During those weeks, Derek received a call from Mrs. Patterson. She asked him to come to her office, and his heart had jumped a little, wondering if somehow he was in trouble, if the anonymous report had been traced back to him in a way that would cause problems. But when he sat down across from her desk, she was smiling. "Derek," she said, "we've been reviewing your work, and we've been particularly impressed with your integrity and professionalism. The way you handled that complaint, the thoroughness of the documentation, the fact that you followed proper channels even when it was personal, that's exactly what we need in this department. We'd like to offer you a promotion. Full-time position. Supervisor track. Better salary, better benefits. For a moment, Derek couldn't speak. He felt his throat tighten, felt emotion welling up that he had to blink back. His salary would increase enough that rent wouldn't be a constant anxiety, that he could maybe start saving, that he could breathe a little easier. But more than the money, more than the title, he felt respected. Not just as an employee, but as a man. Someone had seen his worth, had recognized not just his work but his character. You handled that perfectly, Mrs. Patterson continued. We need more officers like you. Thank you, Derek managed to say, his voice steady despite what he was feeling. I won't let you down. As for Clifford, the weeks after his public humiliation were quiet ones. He barely came out of his apartment. When he did, he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The man who had fed off attention, even negative attention, now seemed to shrink from it. Eventually, inevitably, he quietly moved out of the compound, unable to face the people he once mocked, unable to walk past Derek's door without remembering his downfall. A moving truck came one Tuesday afternoon, and Clifford left without ceremony, without goodbye, just gone. A new tenant moved in upstairs, a polite man in his 30s named Marcus who worked as a teacher. One morning, about a week after he'd moved in, as Derek stepped out for work in his pressed uniform, Marcus was on his balcony watering a small plant he'd placed there. Good morning, sir, Marcus said with a genuine smile, the kind that came from simple courtesy rather than mockery. Derek smiled back, a real smile that reached his eyes, and replied, good morning, and welcome. He looked at his doorstep as he walked toward it. Clean, peaceful, untouched. No trash. No filth. No degradation waiting for him to clean up before he could start his day. The place that once symbolized humiliation now represented something else entirely. It represented strength. It represented patience that paid off. It represented the truth that sometimes, silence isn't weakness at all. Sometimes silence is strategic. Sometimes silence is the quiet gathering of evidence. Sometimes silence is wisdom knowing that the right moment will come. And when that right moment comes, when justice finally arrives not through violence or revenge but through truth and accountability, even the quiet ones get justice. Especially the quiet ones. Because they're the ones who understand that real power doesn't announce itself. Real power doesn't need to throw trash on other people to feel superior. Real power is knowing the systems, understanding the rules, documenting everything, and letting the truth speak louder than any insult ever could. Derek walked to work that morning with his head high, his steps confident, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The city was still the same, rent was still high, life was still hard in many ways. But he had proven something to himself. He had proven that dignity wasn't something someone else could take from you unless you let them. He had proven that patience combined with knowledge was more powerful than aggression combined with ignorance. He had proven that the system, when used correctly, when accessed by someone who understood it, could actually work the way it was supposed to. And most importantly, he had proven that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Because while Clifford had seen only a young black man he could bully, only a tenant he could disrespect, only someone without power or recourse, he had failed to see who Derek really was. He had failed to see the professional. The official. The man with a badge and authority and the ability to document violations. He had failed to see past his own prejudice, and that failure had cost him everything. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity matters, that justice should be available to everyone regardless of who they are or where they come from, then hit that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let the world see that justice still exists, that patience still pays off, and that black dignity is not up for debate, not now, not ever. This is Black Struggles TV, where we tell the truth, one story at a time, because these stories matter. Because representation matters. Because seeing justice served, even in small ways, even in personal battles, reminds us that the fight is worth it. That we are worth it. That our dignity, our humanity, our right to live without being constantly degraded, those things are worth fighting for, worth being patient for, worth documenting and reporting and standing up for when the moment is right. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, you never know who you're really dealing with when you try to pour garbage on someone's doorstep. You might just be pouring it on exactly the wrong man.